So we all know once upon a time, Europe was dominated by a system called feudalism. It was a hierarchical system of land use and patronage that dominated Europe between the 9th and 14th centuries. Under feudalism, a monarch's kingdom was divided and subdivided into agricultural estates called manors. The nobles who controlled these manors oversaw agricultural production and swore loyalty to a king. Centralized power in the hands of a few. It also created massive social inequality. And eventually, due to a number of events, it waned and then came to an end, and this marked the end of what's called the Middle Ages. The first reason was what's called the 100 Years' War. Because vassals and serfs were required to work the manor year in and year out, bound by law to a lifetime of labor, when war broke out between England and France in 1337, both nations had huge military buildups. The ranks of these armies were fueled with the feudal laborers. What did this do? This constricted the labor pool. Less workers, less laborers, weakened feudal power. And the other major event was the Black Death. 10 years into the start of the 100 Years' War, the bubonic plague broke out in Europe. As it spread across Europe, it wiped out somewhere between a third to half of Western Europe's total population. Couple that with all of the men that were off in France and England fighting the 100 Years' War, the agricultural output was put under severe pressure. As a result of the war and the plague, Europe's population shrunk to a point that peasant labor became quite valuable. In order to get this unskilled labor, the owners of Europe's manors had to pay higher and higher wages. A competition was introduced into the system, and this early capitalist system kicked off what is known as the Renaissance. Landowners turned to privatized farming rather than rule from the top. Laborers began demanding and were given better wages and additional liberties. So the key to all this, the downfall of feudalism, came because the pool of unskilled labor got smaller and smaller. This helped people transcend their socioeconomic status, and it helped those even at the bottom earn more and more, which pushed up the wages of everyone, toppling a centralized power structure. You can see here the time frame we're talking about. About 1500, the GDP, the output of all of humanity, was about 500 billion. It took 300 years to double our GDP as humanity till about 1820 here to get to 1 trillion. 300 years. But as we modernized, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? Look how long we just basically treaded water. More freedom, more value of unskilled labor, inventions, all these things kick off. It took 300 years to double our GDP, but then from 1820 to 1870, it doubled again, but this time in only 50 years. And you begin to see the exponential growth. The time in which it takes to double humanity's output begins doubling faster and faster and faster until we get to the, modern times, 121 trillion. Look at that, 1820, it was 1.2 trillion. Here we are, and this goes up to 2018, 121 trillion. A rising tide does lift all boats, but it isn't guaranteed. Economic growth is not guaranteed. You got to look at what works and what doesn't work. No idealism, no pie in the sky, crystal palaces in your mind of how things should be. What works and what doesn't. Now there's an interesting phenomenon here. Tampa's McDonald's exposes America's systemic labor shortage, forced to pay people $50 to interview. And I see this all over around here. I see kiosks and signs, instant interviews. And this is a small town. At McDonald's in Tampa, Florida, they are offering $50 to show up for a job interview. Even with free money plastered in big, bold black letters on its menu sign, facing a busy roadway, there are reportedly still no takers. Think you could just go on 4 interviews a day, you'd be getting a pretty decent wage. So Business Insider spoke with a franchisee who owns a fast food restaurant in Tampa who said the idea to hand out free money is an attempt to secure workers. The value of unskilled labor is going up. He said he would do whatever it takes to hire workers. He says at this point, if we can't keep our drive-thrus moving, then I'll pay $50 for an interview. He owns 60 McDonald's restaurants across the Tampa area. Casper said McDonald's business is booming, but labor shortage has made workers harder to find. His problems are merely a reflection of a much larger significant labor shortage developing across the country, as trillions in Biden stimulus checks are now incentivizing potential workers not to seek employment, but to sit back and chill and collect the next stimmy check for doing absolutely nothing in what is becoming the world's greatest under-the-radar experiment, UBI. We currently have 100 million workers who are out of the labor force and only 6.8 million who want a job, and a record 94 million that don't want a job. And so this is interesting, right? You can get this labor shortage through government intervention in UBI, but again, that costs a lot. We're seeing a ton of inflation. The price of lumber, for example, is hitting all-time highs, and nobody is going to be able to afford a place to live soon. But it does show the idea of, if you shrink the labor force, is there a way to shrink the labor force without just handing out, quote, free government money, which of course is going to cause inflation down the line? Is there a way to constrict the labor force? I mean, look what happens here. Double your salary in the middle of nowhere, North Dakota, during the oil boom, where there wasn't a lot of people because they had booming industry. You could make $15 an hour serving tacos. Oh, there's the fight for 15 right there. What was the answer? Drilling for oil. $25 an hour waiting tables, $80,000 a year driving trucks. All you had to do was move to one of the tiny towns surrounding the oil-rich Bacon Formation, estimated to hold anywhere between 4 billion and 24 billion barrels of oil. And it is because oil companies have only recently discovered ways to tap this reserve, and along with the manpower needed to extract the oil, the town is now scrambling to find workers to support the new rush of labor. A shortage of labor drives wages up. The shortage of labor in the feudal era drove wages up. It caused the collapse of the oppressive feudal system and ushered in an era of greater freedom. So what are our options? We can do a lot of government intervention. We can do this UBI, which injects money that's printed out of thin air into the system and creates massive inflation and makes everything unaffordable. Or we can increase the wages of those at the bottom, which then grows up, right? If the janitor's making $15 an hour, the forklift driver makes $20. If the forklift driver makes $20, the office worker makes $30. Everyone's wages get pushed up all the way up the scale. Not to mention an increase in freedom, as we saw at the end of the feudal era. So the key lies in this unskilled labor. Well, I can think of about 9 million unskilled laborers that aren't supposed to be in this country. What if you got rid of them? If you just shrunk the labor pool by 9 million, it would drive the wages up. Build that wall, deport those that don't belong here, cancel any future green cards, and force companies to hire America. You want to do business in America, you have to hire American workers. Well, Americans don't want to do those jobs. Yeah, not for $2 a day. But if those wages, there is a point where Americans will go work out in the fields. There is a point. Would you do it for $50 an hour? Would you do it for $100? Yeah, you can make wages grow. And then, as I've proposed a love it or leave it voluntary exile program, anyone that's part of the Hate America crowd, offer them a one-time stimulus payout to leave, right? leave the country. We'll give you 6 months median pay of the average worker, but you have to leave America and go live wherever you want. Whatever country your ideology says is better. The less people you have at the low end, the more you're going to push up wages, the more everybody benefits. Get that wall. Stop the immigration. Get people out that don't belong here. Get people out that don't want to be here. And you will see real wealth created. Of course, Biden's going in the opposite direction. They're going to stop fining illegal immigrants who don't leave the U.S. and cancels their debt. On Friday, they ended the Trump-era policy of fining illegal immigrants who have failed to leave the United States, claiming there is no evidence they work. I thought there was no evidence walls work, too, but of course, it's gotten so bad down there, even Joe Biden is considering finishing the wall. Finish the wall, but pay them to come in, offer massive stimulus. I don't know, kind of contradictory, schizophrenic feeling-based policy. According to reports, some illegal immigrants had fines of up to $500,000. But take a step back. Think about, all right, if shrinking the unskilled labor pool increases freedom and caused the downfall of an oppressive feudal system, increase the standard of living, and of course, to attract talent, they'll pay you for an interview. Well, then they're going to train you to keep you on board. They want to keep their workers. More people, more training, more skilled labor, higher wages up the ladder because you're starting from a higher level than before. Well, what would the opposite do? What would be doing like what Biden's doing, encouraging unskilled labor to come in, encouraging people by the millions, encouraging people to come in that have this gray, nebulous immigration status where they're not subject to minimum wage laws, they're not subject to workers' protection in OSHA, and they don't get breaks and lunch and all these benefits. If they're hurt, you can just fire them. What does that do? What does a massive increase in unskilled labor with none of the usual protections that American workers enjoy do? Well, that drives down the price of labor across the board in America. Well, what does that do? That is the reestablishment of the old feudal system. People call it's referred to as neo-feudalism. You burden the people with, student loans, unpayable mortgages, credit card debt, and you have actually reestablished a ruling elite class. An open border neo-feudal utopia where power resides only in the hands of a few sounds just like the New World Order to me.